And I'm just going to quickly pop over and share like so. And perfect. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the 5th talk of Fermentology webinar series. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. First off, hi, Michelle from Applied Ecology. Second off, just like normal, we won't be able to have a Q&A because there's just too darn many of you. So Michael's going to give us contact information at the end. If you have any questions, hang on to them and then just contact Michael afterwards. And yeah, we have a really special talk today. I'm really excited about this talk. Special Tuesday afternoon talk with Michael Kalanty. He is an author, bread baker, sensory scientist, and certified master taster out of San Francisco. And he's going to be walking us through today a tasting of savoring sourdough bread. Without any further ado, Michael, go ahead.
Well, welcome everybody to the first of its kind online bread tasting. Thank you for tuning in. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. I want to do a sensory warm-up stretch to teach you how to tune in to your bank of flavor memories. Each of us has in our brains a collection of flavors, aromas, basic tastes, textures, temperatures, and they're cataloged in our brain and they're tied directly to our memory. It's what's at work, for example, when you have, say, a comfort food from your childhood, and all of those flavors will flood your brain with a number of memories of sitting at the table with your grandmother, or maybe a trip to Italy or something like that. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to say a food, and then I want you to visualize that food. I want you to taste it as best as you can, smell it. And as soon as you get that sensation in your palate, well, then you can let that go. And then I'll go to the next one. Take a sip of water if you have to cleanse your palate. There will be 5 of them all together. Are you ready? Close your eyes. First, I want you to visualize vanilla ice cream. I want you to see the scoop going through the flavor, and I want you to see the vanilla specks and the ice cream curling on itself. Next, now I want you to visualize peanut butter. Chunky or smooth, your preference. Just taste it, and as best as you can, spread that around the inside of your mouth. Dismiss that one. The next food is Welch's grape jelly. What does that taste like? What does that feel like? Okay, the next one. I want you to lick an envelope. And if you don't have an envelope, lick a stamp. What's the flavor of that? What's the taste of that? And now I have one more. And the last one is a sugar substitute. Just maybe visualize that tiny little speck of white powder on the rim of the glass that didn't get stirred in and dissolved. What does that feel like? What does that taste like? Okay, so that concludes the exercise. You can open your eyes now. So the question is, what does this collection of terms have in common? Well, depending on your flavor memories, there's any number of connections that you might have made, but I chose 5 food experiences that are sweet, different levels of sweetness. Each of us, however, has a different perception of how sweet something is. What I think is a moderate sweet, someone else may think is high, or someone else may think is low. So what we have to do is establish a grading system, a system of references that we can relate to so that we understand what we're talking about. So imagine, if you will, a sweetness intensity scale. And it goes from left to right, and the intensities go from very low to very high. What I'd like you to do now is to take a few seconds, and those 5 food experiences that you just called to mind, I want you to rank them in order from low sweet to high sweet using this scale. Here's a slide of all the tastes, of all the foods rather, so you can have that as reference. Are you ready for the answers? Now, these aren't answers per se, because I said somebody's moderate, maybe somebody else is low. But what's important is that you ordered them in a series that is somewhat similar to this. Now, as a teacher, I wanted to build a training tool for my students to help them develop their power to catalog and to remember the flavors and tastes of the breads that they ate. This is very important when you're in the bakery at 3 in the morning and you're trying to determine, oh, wait, is this the way I want to go with this brioche? Maybe I should do something else. So having these memories is a very valuable tool for a baker. So I wanted something like this, but for bread, of course. So I sought out Dr. Ann Noble, who taught sensory evaluation at UC Davis in the wine program. She explained her wheel is based in cognitive psychology. Aromas and flavors are grouped in broad categories according to how people perceive them as being similar. If we look at this detail, you can see there are broad categories such as vegetative or fruity, and fruity is divided into smaller groups such as berry or tree fruit, and then even further divisions down to strawberry and raspberry. Now, whereas wine is thought of as a blend of these aromas, I discovered that bread actually has 3 separate components that can be analyzed independently and give you information about how your proofing is going, how your fermentation is going, and how you may or may not adjust your baking. So I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, literally, but I did want a graphic that would relate for students what it is that we're after. So this is what I came up with. You can see the 3 aspects of bread that have their own collection of aromas and flavors are the crumb, or the interior, the crust, and then a vague concept called character, grain character. So let me explain what I mean by each one of these. In the crumb, the primary tastes that we recognize are sweetness and sourness. It's the alchemy of the baker to adjust these. If you choose oat flour to complement your wheat, you'll develop sweeter flavors in your bread. If you choose some rye to supplement, then you'll develop tangy flavors. In the crust, now this is really where the realm of the oven comes into play, and the set of skills to help a bread rise to its fullest and to caramelize and get the colors and the flavors that we want on the crust. Well, that's an entirely different set of skills from blending and developing and kneading and fermenting your dough in the first place. And then the final one is what's called grain character. Now, this is a little on the intermediate level, so we won't really address that today, but I'll give you a analogy using milk, cow's milk. And in a very simplistic character, the milk has sweetness, it has dairy tones, there's maybe grassiness, and just the tiniest little bit of sour. Now, as that ferments and becomes, say, a yogurt or say a soft cheese or something like that, the freshness kind of dissipates. A tangier flavor takes on. We lose the grassy notes. And then, as an extreme, think of Reggiano Parmesan and the nutty character that comes from that, and the almost astringency and the creaminess that it delivers. Now, they're all dairy products, but they have different characters. Well, now that I have a basic approach to how students are going to talk about these, I needed to collect words that I would put in the lexicon to describe these sensations. Well, a brilliant stroke of luck. For a couple of decades now, I've had the opportunity to work with a group called Chef's Best. They're an independent company that conduct tasting panels on a variety of consumer food products. Outstanding products become eligible for the Chef's Best seal. Now, the backbone of this process is a team of professional chefs who have undergone further training to become certified as master tasters. These chefs can sniff and taste and smell and chew, and they can give you exactly the precise word to define what it is they experience. And although Chef's Best as a company wasn't officially involved in my project here, any number of sensory professionals, aroma chemists, and chef master tasters served as my sounding board during this project. And many of them just said, yes, we'll gladly be your tasters for any of your breads. So I want to give a shout out of thanks to everybody in that community who helped me. So chewy, that's a word. As a descriptor, it's not really very precise. I can have a chewy New York bagel, or I can have a chocolate chip cookie, which is also chewy. Now, these are very different experiences. So the word chewy is not so much a sensory experience as it is a mechanical one. What's important when you taste your bread is to correlate how much chewing you do to what the texture of the bread is. So I came up with what I call the chew test. Let me explain how this works before we start. Okay, so we're going to take a piece of the interior of the bread. I try to take something that's about the size of maybe a quarter or a $50 or something like that, or the largest piece I can and still manage it easily. So I put that in my mouth all at once and I bite down on it. And when my teeth come back, then I have maybe 2 or 3 pieces. Then I chew again, and then I have maybe 4 or 5 pieces. Each time I chew, I feel the spring back of the bread becoming less and less. Now, there's a certain point where there's hardly any spring back, and all the pieces kind of form into a ball, into a wad. In sensory lingo, this is called chewing to a bolus, to a ball. I call it the chew test. So now I'm visualizing a scale that measures the duration of this chew from left to right, from short to long. I put some benchmarks up there, and on the one end, I have that chewy New York bagel, and then on the other end, I have a Ritz cracker. So what I want you to do is, I want you to take a sample from the crumb of your bread. Take something large enough that's manageable and count the number of chews and rank this on your scale. Whenever you're ready, you can start. Now, I test baked a loaf of sourdough using Dr. Aaron McKenney's basic formula. On my sample, I counted 16 chews. So that puts this up in the moderately high range of chewiness. Now, as they say in commercials, your results may differ. If you use a bread flour, for example, instead of all-purpose, you'll get more chews out of that product. On a technical end, if your bread didn't proof as much as it could, then you won't get as many chews and it will actually feel a little bit softer. This is a good point for me to say there are no right or wrong answers. The very redeeming factor of being a sensory being is that whatever you sense, whatever you perceive, well, that is correct. So it's not going to be the same as everyone else's. When we do master tasting panels, we look for consensus, for a very narrow kind of spread on the range, etc. All right, so let's take a break and let's look at how tasting actually works. So here's Professor Flavor, and the basic equation that he has is that, well, our basic tastes are sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. And there's a fifth one called umami. Umami is a meatiness, it's a browning. When most people describe umami, they think of a grilled steak. We basically recognize all of these tastes on our tongue, although we have taste receptors in our nasal cavity, down our throat, in our esophagus. The nose is where the volatile flavor aromas come from the bread. And this is what I was talking earlier about how the brain takes those and categorizes them. It's the combination of this aroma and the taste that we recognize as flavor. But that's only where the magic starts. There's a much more powerful tool, and most people never take advantage of it. It's a phenomenon called retronasal olfaction. And that's a textbook way of saying, hey, I can smell this in the back of my throat. It happens when volatile aromas are perceived not by the nose, but through a hole in the back of your throat that lead up into the nasal cavity. It's a very different kind of smelling. And the way to activate that is to exhale through your nose with your mouth open. That way you're getting the flavor and the taste coming in and the retronasal effect as well. As you chew, the combination of heat and pressure and saliva, it reduces, it exposes all of these volatile aroma compounds. These are those wavy lines that come from the plate of donuts that stare at Homer Simpson. We call these volatiles, and they collect in the roof of the mouth in the part of the nasal cavity. Now, if all of that sounds too complex, I offer this diagram. This actually was the cover of my third grade science report. So to wrap this up, I want to give you a short list of notes, and I want to see how your own flavor memory works, if you can put these together and identify the food I'm talking about. The first note is plump raisins. And now I have dark caramel. And now I have a fruity kind of sour. And now I have toasted oak. So your brain is sorting through those flavors, and maybe it came up with balsamic vinegar, specifically aged balsamic. And those are the primary flavor notes in that product. All of this points to the power of aromas. We can smell and we can chew and we can breathe out through our nose, but it's up to us to think about those and focus on those sensations and catalog them and develop words to describe them so that these aromas have more power in our flavor bank. So now I'd like you to resample your bread. This time, I want you to focus on the sourness intensity. Take approximately the same size sample piece as before and chew it as you did earlier. Here's a scale for your reference with some food benchmarks. When you're ready, it's all yours. Now my sample is fairly sour. I would rank it dead center in the high section, just about where the O in yogurt is. Now there's a concept of umbrella words, like sour. It can encompass any number of other words. It's a bass note. To use a musical analogy, it's a bass note, like a middle C, that then you can play the E and the G on top, and you can create a chord with different sound, with different flavors, with different colors. A C major chord sounds quite different from a C minor, but it still is based on the bass note of a C. Now, how that relates to food, let's look at a strawberry. If you take a fresh strawberry, the notes you might get out of it are a very low kind of chlorophyll note. You'll get a little bit of perfume and maybe a floral note out of it. And there'll be a sweetness and a sourness that kind of vie with one another depending on how ripe the strawberry is. And maybe the sides of your tongue puckered a little bit while you were thinking of that, and that's the astringency. That's part of that. So lots of foods come in strawberry, but they don't all have the same set of notes. Strawberry ice cream can have a perfumed note in it. A power bar has a dried strawberry character. In fruit leather, there might be a jammy, cooked kind of character. And let me see, in a pink breakfast cereal, I think you're going to get a candied note. They're all strawberry, but they all have different characters. So now, why is this relevant? Well, in your readings on sourdough, you may have come across the terms lactic acid and acetic acid. Now, these are chemical compounds. They're measurable on spectrometers, and they are side effects of the fermentation process. But they don't do very much of eliciting flavor memories in the people you're talking to. So what we want to do is we want to create some sort of way of dealing with these. And that is where the idea of character comes in. If we look at this slide on sour crumb flavors, you see that there is primarily sweet notes and sour notes, as I said earlier. Well, in my research with the master tasters, every bread I gave them, they were able to say, yes, this is sour, but this is sour like a green apple. Or this is sour like, oh, Greek yogurt, but with honey. And that's how precise these tasters are. So you can see the more popular responses to this chart. So I want to repeat the sourness test again. This time, remember to chew with your mouth open, exhaling through your nose, scan through the list of food products and see what character the sourness of your bread has for you. Whenever you're ready. Now, in my sample of Dr. McKinney's sourdough, I experienced Granny Smith apples, yellow grapefruit, and just the smallest hint of butter. I would characterize my sourness as being fairly fruity. Let's move on to the crust flavors. When we evaluate crust flavors, we have to come to grips first with bitterness. Bitterness receptors are everywhere on our palates. They're in the roof of our mouth, down our esophagus, as I said. But young tasters tend to focus mostly on the back of their throat or the roof of their mouth just above that. Some bitter foods are unsweetened chocolate, coffee, vodka, spinach. Here's a chart. Here's a chart that ranks bitterness intensity. What I want you to do now is to take a sample of your crust and chew that and see what sorts of bitterness you can get out of this. Don't focus on specific notes. We're just after the bitterness intensity. Now, again, on my sample, well, I did what's called a bien cuit, a very well-baked crust on mine. So the bitterness that I got is somewhere between tonic water and Guinness stout. Now, how does bitterness develop in the crust? Well, let's take a look at what happens as sugar cooks. If you take sugar and water, dilute it, and then you start to cook it, it goes through a series of color changes. At the upper left, it's very clear. The sweetness is very high. As you cook it more, it starts to get a little bit of color in it. The sweetness decreases as the bitterness enters into the equation. Until you're at the very bottom right, where it's very dark, like kind of a reddish dark, almost like a Cajun roux, and the bitterness is quite high and the sweetness note is quite low. In the process, we have this inverse relationship between sweetness and the bitterness. All of these accumulate on the crust in the process of baking. Now, in this next slide, as this is happening with the sugar, there are so many other transformations going on in the dough, as Peter Reinhardt focused on last week. And the dough, or the flour, the grain is broken down into protein and starch, and the protein becomes broken into amino acids. And some of this is enzyme activity, some of it is yeast fermentation, and then these amino acids become fermented by enzymes and they create a number of flavor profiles. Now, at the same time, the starch is broken down into different chains and different types of sugars. Each of these sugars is broken down into different flavor notes. And this is where bacterial fermentation really comes into play. So on the surface of this dough, we have any combination of proteins, amino acids, starches, sugars, flavor notes, whatever. And these align in as many different permutations as they can manage. Each one of these becomes a flavor note in its own right. And it cooks from light to medium to dark. So it changes its character as the crust continues to cook. This whole phenomenon is called the Maillard reaction. And it has to do with the caramelization of food, the caramelization on the surface of food. And this is where the umami, where the meatiness character of foods is developed. Now let's take a look at the crust detail. Now, depending on the flour and the grain that the chef chose in the fermentation, you're going to get any number of categories: roasted, fruity, resinous. The one category that I get more questions about is the resinous one. And a resinous food, think of pine needles, a Christmas tree, or fresh rosemary. It's that recurring oiliness character. So now for our final exercise, I'd like you to take another piece of your crust sample and chew it, and this time see what specific notes you are able to bring out of your crust. In my sample, I found dark beer, French roast coffee beans, unsweetened chocolate, and there was a little bit of blackstrap molasses. So that concludes our tasting fundamentals right there. There are many, many more topics that we can go into, but these are the basic skills that every time you taste bread, if you focus and think about those memories, you will develop your own flavor chart to such a degree that you'll be able to make different changes in your bread, put some rye flour in, maybe put a little bit of oat flour in, or some sorghum to bring a honey flavor to it. This is the realm, this is the alchemy of the baker, and this is your key to that experience. Thank you so much.
Yay! Thank you, Michael. Brilliant talk. Thank you so much. I hope everybody had a great time tasting through their sourdough loaf. I wish I had mine in front of me, but at least I can watch it back on YouTube and do it later. This Thursday, we do have a talk. So today's Tuesday, day of the week check. Today is Tuesday. There is another talk on Thursday, and that is on the biology of the bread bees make, which begs the question, do bees' knees need? I'd like to know. You'll have to tune in on Thursday to find out. But otherwise, if you have any questions, please do contact Michael at his website. It is www.michaelkalanty.com. I'm sure you can use your Google skills to find it just fine. But if you run into any problems, you all have my email address because I've emailed you probably a million times by now. And you can reach out to me and I can direct you that way. That's it. Thank you again, Michael, and hopefully see everybody on Thursday.
Thank you.